In 1645, a man knocked on the door of a village magistrate in Essex, England. He was 25 years old, well-dressed, carrying a leather-bound book, and he had a business proposal. "I can find the witches in your village," he said, "for a price." The magistrate hesitated. "Witches? In their quiet village? 20 shillings per visit," the man continued, "plus additional fees for each witch I discover. I guarantee results." His name was Matthew Hopkins, and he wasn't lying about the results. Over the next 2 years, Matthew Hopkins would personally be responsible for the execution of more than 300 people, mostly women, more than all other English witch hunters combined. In the entire previous century, he executed more witches than the Spanish Inquisition executed in Spain during the same period, more than Salem would execute 50 years later, more than any single person in English history. And he didn't do it for God. He didn't do it for justice. He didn't even do it because he believed they were actually witches. He did it because witch hunting was the most profitable business in England. And Matthew Hopkins had figured out how to industrialize murder. Welcome to Ash and Crown History, where we explore the brutal truths that textbooks ignore. I'm your host, and today we're examining the real Witchfinder general, a man who weaponized fear, systematized torture, and turned mass execution into a business model that earned him the equivalent of 200,000 in just 2 years. If you're ready to understand how one man convinced entire communities to pay him to torture and execute their neighbors, and why his methods are still being used today, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to discover will change how you see authority, accusations, and the terrifying ease with which ordinary people become complicit in systematic murder. Matthew Hopkins kept detailed records. We have his account books, his letters, his self-published defense pamphlet, court records documenting every trial, even his victims' final words. We can trace his path of destruction village by village, victim by victim, confession by confession, payment by payment. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why Hopkins is more terrifying than any fictional monster. Because he proved something dark about human nature. People will pay someone to kill their neighbors. They'll even compete for the privilege. Let's start with the book he was carrying. Because that book, the Malleus Maleficarum, wasn't his weapon. It was his sales pitch. The sales pitch, how a 150-year-old book became a murder manual. The Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, was published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor who'd been kicked out of multiple cities for his disturbing obsession with women's sexuality and torture. The book claimed to be a guide for identifying witches. But read it carefully, really carefully, and you realize what it actually is. A system for generating confessions from anyone, regardless of guilt or innocence. Here's how the system works. And I need you to pay close attention, because this pattern appears throughout history. In medieval Europe, in Stalin's purges, in McCarthy's hearings, in modern cancel culture, the targets change. The method doesn't. Step 1. Make accusations unfalsifiable. The Malleus Maleficarum lists signs of witchcraft that literally anyone could exhibit. Unfriendly to neighbors? Witch. Too friendly to neighbors? Covering your guilt. Definitely a witch. You cry when accused? Which trying to gain sympathy. You don't cry when accused? Which using demonic power to suppress emotions. You confess immediately? Which you refuse to confess? Which using magic to resist. You float in the swimming test. Which you sink and drown? Innocent, but dead. So, see the trap? Every possible response confirms guilt. There is no defense. No action you can take proves innocence. The accusation itself is the verdict. Step 2. Legitimize torture as investigation. The Malleus Maleficarum provided legal and theological justification for torture. Not as punishment, as investigation. You're not being tortured because you're guilty. You're being tortured to determine if you're guilty. Big difference. One is illegal brutality. The other is proper legal procedure. But here's the genius, and I use that word with absolute horror, The book also explains that witches can use demonic power to resist pain. So if you endure torture without confessing, that's not evidence of innocence. That's evidence you're using witchcraft to resist. The logic is perfect. You cannot win. Confess equals guilty. Don't confess equals using magic, therefore guilty. Step 3. Create profit incentive. And this is where Matthew Hopkins enters the story. Before Hopkins, witch hunting was sporadic, reactive. Someone would accuse a neighbor, there'd be a trial, maybe an execution. But it was inefficient, unpredictable, not scalable. Hopkins looked at this system and saw an opportunity. He realized, if you're going to base a business on finding witches, you need to find witches. Lots of them, quickly, consistently, profitably. So Hopkins created the world's first freelance Witchfinder business model. He didn't wait for accusations. He went looking for clients. He'd arrive in a village, meet with magistrates, and make his pitch. You have witches here. You just don't know it yet. I can find them. Here's my fee structure. And the fees were substantial. 20 shillings per town visit, roughly 1,000 today. Additional fees for each witch discovered, travel expenses, accommodation, salary for assistants. He employed a team, follow-up visits if needed in 1645 to 1647. Just 2 years. Hopkins earned approximately £1,000. That's equivalent to 200,000 plus in modern purchasing power. From witch finding. Think about that. A 25-year-old man with no formal education, no official position, and no legal authority made a fortune by convincing villages to pay him to torture and execute their neighbors. How did he do it? If you're starting to see how systematic evil actually works, how profit incentives shape atrocities, you need to subscribe to Ash and Crown History. We don't just tell you what happened in history. We show you the mechanisms, the systems, the patterns that repeat. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because the story gets much, much darker. Hopkins didn't just have a book and a sales pitch. He had a method, a systematic, replicable, terrifyingly efficient method for turning innocent people into executed witches. And that method reveals something crucial about human psychology and social control. Let me show you exactly how it worked. The method. Industrial-scale murder disguised as Justice Matthew Hopkins arrived in a village with his assistants, his account books, and his copy of the Malleus Maleficarum prominently displayed. The book was always visible. It gave him authority, legitimacy. This wasn't personal vendetta or random violence. This was official, church-approved witch hunting based on a 150-year-old theological text. Hopkins' method had 5 phases. Each phase was designed to break the victim psychologically before any physical torture occurred. He wasn't a brute. He was a system engineer. Phase 1. Strategic target selection. Hopkins didn't pick victims randomly. He was strategic, calculating. He looked for specific profiles. Elderly women living alone, widows, spinsters, no male protection, women with property, which would be confiscated after execution, enriching local authorities, women with enemies. Hopkins listened for gossip, grudges, local conflicts. Women who were difficult, argumentative, independent, unconventional, practicing folk medicine. Basically, any woman who lacked male protection and had annoyed anyone was a potential target. But here's the genius of Hopkins' targeting. He never accused anyone powerful. Never wealthy merchants. Never magistrates' wives. Never anyone with connections who could fight back. He targeted the vulnerable, because vulnerable people can't resist. And when vulnerable people are executed, no one with power cares enough to intervene. Once Hopkins identified his target, he'd have her arrested and brought to a holding cell. And then the real horror began. Phase 2. Forced waking, sleep deprivation torture. This is Hopkins' signature innovation. This is what made him more effective than previous witch hunters. Instead of starting with physical torture, which was messy, public, and sometimes generated sympathy, Hopkins started with something far more devastating. Forced waking. The accused would be placed in a cell with Hopkins' assistants watching her 24 hours a day. Every time she started to fall asleep, every single time they'd wake her up, walk her around the cell, poke her, make noise, pour water on her, prevent sleep. This continued for days, sometimes a full week. Modern sleep deprivation studies show that after 72 hours without sleep, humans begin to hallucinate. After 96 hours, cognitive function collapses. After a week, you'll say anything, confess to anything, just to make it stop. Hopkins knew this. He called the technique watching for the familiar. The official justification was that if you watched a witch long enough, her demonic familiar, a cat, a toad, an imp, would appear to feed from her body. Of course, no demons ever appeared. But that didn't matter. After 4 to 7 days without sleep, the accused was broken, confused, hallucinating, desperate. She'd confess to anything Hopkins wanted. She'd name anyone as a fellow witch. She'd describe impossible acts, flying, shape-shifting, meeting Satan, in vivid detail her exhausted mind invented. And Hopkins would write it all down. Every delusional confession, every hallucinatory detail, every name she mentioned in her sleep-deprived state. Those confessions became evidence, legal evidence, presented in court, used to justify execution. If you're disturbed by how easily torture can be disguised as legitimate procedure, and how easily courts accept evidence extracted through torture, then you need to stay subscribed to Ash and Crown History. Because this pattern appears again and again throughout history. Different methods, different targets, same mechanism. But Hopkins wasn't done. Some women, even after days without sleep, refused to confess. They maintained their innocence. They endured. For them, Hopkins had Phase 3. Phase 3. The swimming test, public theater of predetermined guilt. The swimming test was public spectacle. Entertainment. Community bonding through collective violence. The accused would be brought to a pond or river. The entire village would gather to watch. Hopkins would make a speech about the sacred duty of rooting out evil. He'd read from the Malleus Maleficarum. He'd build anticipation. Then the accused would be bound. Right thumb tied to left big toe. Left thumb to right big toe. Creating a cross shape with her body meant to reject the devil. She'd be thrown into the water. If she floated, which, the holy water was rejecting her unholy presence. If she sank, innocent, but also drowned. So, problem solved either way. Here's the thing about human bodies and water. Most people float, especially elderly women with less muscle mass. So the swimming test was designed to produce guilty verdicts. But Hopkins didn't actually care about the test result. The test wasn't about finding truth, it was about public commitment. Once the village gathered to watch. Once they threw someone into the water. Once they cheered when she floated or watched silently while she drowned. They were complicit. They'd participated. They couldn't back out now without admitting they'd just murdered someone. The swimming test locked the community into supporting Hopkins. It made them accomplices. And here's the most effective moment. Right before the test. Standing at the edge of the pond. Bound. Exhausted from days of no sleep. Watching the crowd gather. Knowing what's about to happen. Most women confessed right there. They'd admit to witchcraft, hoping confession might lead to mercy. Hoping they could avoid drowning. It never did. Confession just made the execution legally cleaner. But at least they'd die dry. Phase 4. Finding the devil's mark. Medical torture disguised as investigation. For the few who still refused to confess, Hopkins had his final technique. The search for the devil's mark. According to the Malleus Maleficarum, Satan marked his witches with a special spot on their body. A place that felt no pain when pricked. Could be a mole, a birthmark, a scar, a blemish, anything. Hopkins would have the accused stripped completely naked in front of male examiners. Then he'd use his special tool, a spring-loaded retractable pin, to stab various parts of her body while searching for this devil's mark. The tool was designed to deceive. Sometimes the pin retracted into the handle, causing no actual penetration, no pain. Hopkins would stab that spot. The pin would retract, and he'd declare, "Found it." No pain. The devil's mark. Other times, he'd actually stab with a real pin, causing pain. If the victim flinched, he'd say, "Interesting," and move to another spot. Eventually, he'd use the retractable pin again. No pain. There it is. Devil's mark confirmed. The accused couldn't tell which pin was real and which was fake. After days without sleep, stripped naked in front of strangers, being repeatedly stabbed while men examined her body, almost everyone confessed, just to make it stop. Phase 5. The confession presentation and execution. Once Hopkins had a confession, whether from sleep deprivation, swimming test, devil's mark, or all three, he'd present the witch to court. By this point, the accused was destroyed, exhausted. Many were barely coherent. Some had been broken so thoroughly they believed their own forced confessions. Hopkins would read the confession dramatically. The court would ask perfunctory questions. The magistrates, who'd paid Hopkins and were expecting results, would nod gravely. The verdict was always guilty. Execution would be scheduled. Usually hanging in England. Burning was less common there than in continental Europe. Hopkins would collect his full fee. The witch's property would be confiscated, enriching the local authorities who'd hired him. And Hopkins would move to the next village. Over 2 years, he perfected this system, streamlined it, made it efficient. He could process multiple witches simultaneously. His assistants ran the sleep deprivation while he handled swimming tests in different villages. He maximized throughput. He was the Henry Ford of witch hunting. Assembly line murder. This is how Matthew Hopkins executed 300+ people in 2 years. Not through chaos or random violence, but through systematic, methodical, profitable witch-finding. Subscribe to Ash and Crown History if you want to understand how systematic evil actually works. How ordinary people become complicit. How profit drives atrocity. How procedure disguises murder. We explore the mechanisms, not just the events. Hit subscribe. This story is about to get even darker. Because the real horror of Hopkins' method isn't that it worked. It's who it worked on. Let me tell you about some of the victims. Because names matter. These weren't statistics. They were real people with real lives. And their stories reveal exactly who gets targeted when witch hunts begin. The victims. Who dies when profit meets panic. Rebecca West was 67 years old when Matthew Hopkins arrived in Lawford, Essex, in March 1645. She was a widow. She owned a small cottage, modest, but it was property. She had no children, no male relatives, no protection. She practiced folk healing. She knew which herbs helped fevers, which plants eased childbirth pain. She'd delivered half the babies in the village over the past 30 years. In modern terms, she was the village's unlicensed midwife and herbalist. In Hopkins' terms, she was a perfect target. A neighbor and leech accused Rebecca of witchcraft. The reason? Anne's infant child had died of fever 2 weeks after Rebecca treated her. And was grieving, angry. She needed someone to blame. Someone who'd been there when her baby died. Someone who'd failed to save her child. Rebecca was arrested on March 21, 1645. Hopkins performed his standard procedure. Days 1 to 3, sleep deprivation. Hopkins' assistants kept Rebecca awake constantly, walking her around the cell, preventing any rest. Day 4, Rebecca began hallucinating. She spoke to people who weren't there. She saw shadows moving. She was breaking. Day 5. Still no confession. Hopkins escalated to the swimming test. Rebecca was brought to the village pond. The entire village gathered, including an leech who stood at the front of the crowd, watching. Rebecca was bound, thumbs to toes, creating the cross shape. She begged. She pleaded her innocence. She called out to neighbors she'd known for 40 years. No one helped her. They'd paid Hopkins. They'd gathered to watch. They were committed now. Rebecca was thrown into the pond. She floated. The crowd roared. And Leech screamed, "Witch!" Others joined in. The spectacle became a mob. Rebecca, pulled from the water, exhausted and terrified, confessed. She admitted to consorting with the devil. She named her familiar, a cat she called Satan. She claimed she'd used witchcraft to kill Anne's baby. None of it was true. The cat was a stray that hung around her cottage looking for food. Rebecca fed it scraps. That was her familiar. The prosecution later entered into evidence. A black cat seen frequently near the accused property. Rebecca West was hanged on August 19, 1645. Hopkins collected 23 shillings for finding her. Her cottage was confiscated by the local magistrate who'd hired Hopkins. Her cat, the evidence of her demonic compact, was killed by village boys 2 days after her execution. Rebecca West was Hopkins' 14th victim. Let me tell you about some others because the pattern matters. Elizabeth Clark Hopkins' first victim, 80 years old. One-legged, nearly blind. Living in poverty in Manningtree, Essex. Hopkins kept her awake for 4 consecutive nights, 96 hours straight, until she began seeing visions from sleep deprivation. She described imps, demons, and familiars in vivid hallucinatory detail. Hopkins wrote down every word, presented it as confession. Elizabeth was hanged in July 1645. Hopkins later bragged about Elizabeth in his pamphlet. He called her the proof that his methods worked. He described her visions as if they were real, never mentioning the 4 days of forced waking that caused them. John Lowes, the inconvenient vicar, 80 years old. Vicar of Brandeston for 50 years. Respected. Educated. But some of his parishioners didn't like his sermons. They thought he was too Catholic in his practices. When Hopkins came to the area, those parishioners saw an opportunity. John was accused of witchcraft. His crime? Ships had sunk off the coast near his parish. Obviously, he'd used witchcraft to sink them. The fact that the ships sank during documented storms was irrelevant. Hopkins subjected John to the swimming test. At 80 years old, John was thrown into water, bound hand and foot. He floated. After the swimming test and days of sleep deprivation, John Lowes, educated, articulate, a man of God, confessed to sinking ships through witchcraft. He confessed to having familiars. He confessed to consorting with Satan. He was hanged in August 1645. Hopkins collected his fee. The parishioners who disliked his sermons got a new vicar. And West and Rebecca West, daughter, mother and daughter accused together in Lawford, tortured together, tried together, executed together in the same session. Their crime? Being poor, unpopular, and related to each other. Once the mother was accused, Hopkins suggested the daughter must be involved too. It was more efficient to process them together. 2 fees, 2 executions, 1 day's work. Both were hanged in August 1645. Mary Sutton, the dog which accused of bewitching a neighbor's dog. The dog was acting strangely, later revealed to have rabies, though that diagnosis didn't exist yet. Mary was 60 years old. Widowed. Poor. Hopkins extracted her confession through sleep deprivation. She admitted to cursing the dog through demonic power. She was hanged in July 1645. Hopkins collected his fee. The dog died of rabies 2 weeks later. See the pattern? Every single victim was elderly, 60 to 80 years old mostly, powerless, widows, poor, no male protection, convenient, unpopular, or owned property someone wanted, or were in the way. Hopkins never accused. Wealthy merchants, magistrates' wives, anyone with powerful connections, anyone who could afford a real legal defense. The Witchfinder general didn't target dangerous witches. He targeted vulnerable women, because vulnerable women couldn't fight back. And when vulnerable women died, no one with power cared enough to stop it. But here's the question that should haunt you. Why did their neighbors participate? These women had lived in these villages for decades. They'd delivered babies, healed fevers, been part of the community. Why did people who'd known them for 40+ years throw them into ponds? Watch them hang? Cheer at their executions? Subscribe to Ash and Crown History if you want to understand how communities turn on their vulnerable members. How scapegoating works. How profit drives persecution. How ordinary people convince themselves that murder is justice. This isn't just medieval history, this is human psychology. And it repeats. Hit subscribe and keep watching. Because the answer to why did neighbors participate reveals the true genius of Hopkins' system. He didn't force people to kill witches. He gave them permission. The permission structure. How Hopkins convinced communities to kill Matthew Hopkins' real genius wasn't torture. It was social engineering. He understood something fundamental about human nature. People want to hurt those they resent. They want to take what their neighbors have. They want to settle grudges and seize property and feel powerful. But they also want to feel righteous while doing it. Hopkins gave them that. He provided the permission structure that let ordinary people commit murder while feeling like heroes. Here's how the permission structure worked. Permission 1. Expert authority. Hopkins presented himself as an expert. He had the book, the Malleus Maleficarum. He had training. He'd studied the methods. He knew what to look for. When Hopkins said, "This woman is a witch," it wasn't just an accusation. It was an expert diagnosis. Like a doctor diagnosing illness. An authority figure confirming what people suspected. Permission 2. Legal framework. Everything Hopkins did was legal. Technically, he was hired by magistrates. He followed procedures. He extracted confessions. He presented evidence to courts. He got official verdicts. This wasn't mob violence. This was law and order. Justice being served. The system working as intended. Permission 3. Religious justification. The Malleus Maleficarum wasn't just any book. It was a theological text. Approved, sort of, by church authorities. Based on scripture. Used across Europe. Killing witches wasn't murder. It was holy work. Fighting Satan. Protecting the community from evil. How could anyone object to that? Permission 4. Profit motive. Here's the darkest part. Hopkins' fees were paid from confiscated property. The accused witch's cottage, land, possessions, all confiscated after execution. Sold. Divided between local authorities and Hopkins' fees. This meant that accusing someone of witchcraft could be profitable. For everyone involved. Neighbor has land you want? Accuse her of witchcraft. If she's convicted, her land becomes available. Maybe you can buy it cheap from the authorities. Maybe the magistrate gives you a favorable deal because you helped identify a witch. Hopkins' system turned witch hunting into a financial incentive structure. Finding witches enriched the community. Or at least the powerful members of it. Permission 5. Social pressure. Once the first few witches were found and executed, questioning Hopkins became dangerous. After all, who defends witches? Other witches. If you spoke up for the accused, you became suspect. If you questioned Hopkins' methods, you might be his next target. If you challenged the magistrates who'd hired him, you were challenging authority. Silence was safer. Participation was safer. Enthusiasm was safest. So people participated. They watched the swimming tests. They testified about suspicious behavior. They identified potential witches. They cheered at executions. Not because they were evil, because Hopkins had made participation feel safe, profitable, and righteous. This is the real horror of the Witchfinder general. He didn't force anyone to do anything. He just created conditions where killing your neighbors became legal, official procedure, profitable, confiscated property, righteous, fighting Satan, safe, refusing to participate was suspicious, social, community bonding through shared violence, and under those conditions, ordinary people, good people, who loved their families and helped their neighbors and went to church every Sunday, became complicit in systematic murder. 300+ people died. Thousands more participated in killing them. Hopkins made it easy. He made it feel right. That's the system. That's how it worked. If you're seeing parallels to modern scapegoating, modern permission structures for harming the right targets, modern systems where profit drives persecution, you're paying attention. Subscribe to Ash and Crown History. We explore these patterns. We show you the mechanisms. We connect past to present. Because this isn't just history. This is how humans work. And it's still happening. But Hopkins' system had a weakness. A single point of failure. And in 1646, one man found it. The Fall. How a pamphlet killed the witchfinder John Gaule was a minister in Great Staughton, Huntingdonshire. In early 1646, he heard that Matthew Hopkins was heading toward his parish. Gaule had been watching Hopkins' campaign with growing horror. He'd read the reports. He'd seen the lists of the executed. And he'd noticed something Hopkins probably hoped no one would notice. Every single which Hopkins found was poor. Every single execution enriched someone. Every single confession came after torture. Gaule was educated. He could read Latin. He'd actually read the Malleus Maleficarum, not just believed what Hopkins said about it. And he realized Hopkins wasn't finding witches. He was manufacturing them. Gaule wrote a pamphlet. Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcraft. In it, he systematically demolished Hopkins' methods. On sleep deprivation. Is it not possible that a poor old woman, kept from sleep for days and nights together, might speak strange and senseless things? Might confess to impossible acts? Might see visions that exist only in her exhausted mind? How can we call this a true confession? On the swimming test, if she sinks, she drowns as an innocent. If she floats, she is condemned as guilty. What justice is this? What trial condemns all outcomes? Is this not murder disguised as testing? On the devil's mark, show me a human body without blemish, mole, or scar. Is every birthmark now evidence of Satan? How convenient that the mark might be invisible to all but the witchfinder. How profitable that every body examined produces evidence. On confessions under torture. When a person has been tortured for days, shown instruments of pain, promised relief only through admission of guilt, can we honestly call their words confession? Or is this simply the breaking of human will through systematic cruelty? Gaule's pamphlet went viral by 17th century standards. It was reprinted, copied, passed from minister to minister, read from pulpits, discussed in taverns. And suddenly Hopkins had a problem. People were questioning his methods. Publicly, in writing. Hopkins responded with his own pamphlet, The Discovery of Witches, 1647. In it, he defended every aspect of his witch-finding. He insisted his methods were biblically justified. He claimed his success rate, 300+ witches found, proved the methods worked. But here's what's revealing. Hopkins never addressed Gaule's core arguments. He never explained why all his victims were poor and powerless. He never justified sleep deprivation as legitimate interrogation. He never addressed the swimming test's obvious design flaw. He never explained how torture produces reliable confessions. Instead, Hopkins attacked Gaule's motives. He claimed that questioning witchfinders was itself evidence of witchcraft sympathies. After all, who would defend witches except other witches? This tactic had worked before. It had silenced previous critics. It had protected Hopkins from scrutiny. But it didn't work on Gaule. Because Gaule had something Hopkins' previous victims didn't. A platform, pulpit, education, allies. And most importantly, he was male, employed, and respectable. Other ministers began speaking out. They'd been uncomfortable with Hopkins all along. But Gaule gave them permission to voice their doubts. Magistrates began questioning the fees. £1,000 over 2 years? For finding witches? Maybe Hopkins was the one profiting from Satan's work. Villages began closing their doors. When Hopkins arrived with his sales pitch, magistrates suddenly had no budget for witch-finding. By mid-1647, Hopkins' business had collapsed. The fees stopped. The executions stopped. His assistants left to find other work. And then, in August 1647, Matthew Hopkins died. He was 27 years old. The official cause of death, tuberculosis. But here's where legend diverges from documented fact. The legend, Hopkins was subjected to his own swimming test by angry villagers, floated, was condemned as a witch and executed. The documented reality. Hopkins died of tuberculosis at his home in Manningtree. There was no trial, no swimming test, no execution. He died in bed. But ask yourself, why does the legend persist? Why do people want to believe Hopkins was executed by his own methods? Because we need stories where villains get punished, where evil is defeated, where justice is served in poetically appropriate ways. We need Hopkins to die screaming, struggling, knowing what his victims felt. But real history doesn't work that way. Matthew Hopkins died comfortable, surrounded by the money he'd earned. Never prosecuted, never held accountable, never punished for 300+ murders. He made a fortune killing innocent people. And he died rich. That's the real horror of the Witchfinder general. Not that he was evil, but that evil worked. For him. For 2 solid years. And he died unpunished. Subscribe to Ash and Crown History if you want the truth about how evil actually works in the real world. Not the Hollywood version where villains always get punished. The real version where they often die rich and comfortable. Hit subscribe. This matters, because Hopkins has been dead for 377 years. His methods are obsolete. The Malleus Maleficarum is a museum piece. Witch hunting is illegal. So why am I telling you this story in 2024? Because Hopkins' playbook is still in use. The modern playbook. Why this still matters. Matthew Hopkins' business model had 5 key elements. 1. Create unfalsifiable accusations. Accusations that can't be disproven. That feel true. That confirm existing biases. That make any defense look suspicious. 2. Systematize profit from panic. Turn fear into revenue. Build a business around finding hidden threats that only you can detect. 3. Target the vulnerable. Focus on people who can't fight back. Who have no platform, no powerful connections, no resources to resist. 4. Make it seem legitimate. Use authority, credentials, books, institutions, procedures to make persecution seem like proper process. 5. Create community complicity. Make participation feel safe and righteous. Make questioning feel dangerous. Make silence seem like endorsement of evil. Now, I'm not going to name modern examples, you can think of your own. But I'll give you the pattern to watch for. When someone builds a career on finding hidden threats that only they can detect. When the accused are always powerless, never the powerful. When questioning the accusations is treated as proof you're part of the problem. When there's profit in the finding. When communities become complicit through shared participation. That's Hopkins' playbook. Different targets. Different terminology. Same mechanism. The Witchfinder general wasn't unique. He was just unusually good at a pattern that repeats throughout human history. Witch hunts don't end because we become enlightened. They end because they become unprofitable or the targets gain enough power to fight back or someone like Gaule publishes the pamphlet that makes persecution too costly to continue. Hopkins' career ended not because people stopped believing in witches. Belief in witches continued for another 50+ years. It ended because Gaule made it risky to continue. Because magistrates questioned the fees. Because the profit-to-risk ratio shifted. The question isn't, how could people in 1645 believe in witches? The question is, what unfalsifiable accusations do we believe in right now? Who's profiting from our belief? Who are we making vulnerable? And what would it take for us to question the system? If you want to explore these patterns, to understand how systematic evil works across different eras, to see the mechanisms clearly, you need to subscribe to Ash and Crown History. We're building a community that isn't afraid to examine uncomfortable truths about human nature and social systems. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. Join us. Conclusion. The lesson of the Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins executed 300+ people in 2 years. He made a fortune, the equivalent of 200,000. He died comfortable, unpunished, at age 27. Most of his victims were elderly women, widows, People with no power, no connections, no protection. Hopkins didn't invent witch hunting. He industrialized it. He created a systematic, replicable, profitable method for turning innocent people into executed witches. The Malleus Maleficarum gave him the theoretical framework. Fear gave him the market. Human resentment gave him the targets. And the system, magistrates, courts, churches, communities, gave him permission. This is how systematic evil works. Not through chaos or obvious villainy, but through procedure, profit, permission structures, ordinary people doing their jobs, following the rules, collecting their fees, convincing themselves they're the heroes. The real horror of Matthew Hopkins isn't that he was a monster. It's that he wasn't. He was an entrepreneur who identified a market and filled it. He was a businessman who systematized a service. He was a professional who kept good records and maximized efficiency. And 300+ people died so he could turn a profit. If this video changed how you think about accusations, authority, profit-driven persecution, and how ordinary people become complicit in systematic evil, then subscribe to Ash and Crown History right now. We don't just tell you what happened. We show you why it matters. We explore the patterns that repeat. We connect past to present. We build understanding that protects against future atrocities. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. And drop a comment. What modern accusations are unfalsifiable? Who's profiting from fear? What permission structures exist today that let us harm acceptable targets while feeling righteous? Share this video with someone who needs to understand that systematic evil doesn't look like Hollywood villains. It looks like procedure, like business, like ordinary people following incentives. Thanks for watching Ash and Crown History. I'll see you in the next one, where we'll explore more uncomfortable truths about human nature, social systems, and the patterns that repeat throughout history. Matthew Hopkins proved something dark about human nature. Given the right permission structure, ordinary people will pay someone to murder their neighbors. They'll even compete for the privilege. The permission structures have changed. The targets have changed. The mechanism hasn't. Stay curious. Stay questioning. And never forget, the most dangerous systems are the ones that make evil feel like justice. Subscribe now. This matters more than you think.